There are weekends in motorsport that belong to speed. This was supposed to be one of them. The last Sunday of May has always carried a particular weight in the racing world. A day when the sport concentrates itself into something almost overwhelming. Charlotte Motor Speedway, preparing for the Coca-Cola 600, the longest race on the NASCAR calendar. Indianapolis Motor Speedway, filling with the quiet roar of 300,000 people, arriving for the Indianapolis 500, the single most attended one-day sporting event on Earth. And in Montreal, the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, waking up for the Canadian Grand Prix. Formula One, returning to North America with the particular electricity that street circuits always carry. 3 races, 3 continents of fans, 1 weekend. And then, on the evening of May 21st, a statement arrived. It was short. It came from the Busch family, from Richard Childress Racing, and from NASCAR itself, all at once, as if no single voice was large enough to carry it alone. Kyle Busch, 2-time NASCAR Cup Series champion, one of the most decorated drivers in the history of American motorsport, had died. He was 41 years old. He had last won a race 6 days earlier. No cause was given. No warning had been visible to the outside world. He had been testing in a racing simulator in Concord, North Carolina, when he lost consciousness. By the time the statement was released, he was already gone. The motorsport world went quiet in a way it rarely does. Mario Andretti, a man who has seen this sport across 7 decades, who won the Indianapolis 500 and the Formula One World Championship and the Daytona 500, who has buried friends and colleagues and understood better than most what speed costs was at Indianapolis when the news arrived. "It's a shock of my life," he said. "Unbelievable." Dale Earnhardt Jr. posted on social media without preamble, without the careful language of public relations, just grief, plainly stated, from one NASCAR son to another. Denny Hamlin, his teammate for years at Joe Gibbs Racing, a man who had raced alongside him and against him and understood what it meant to share a garage with Kyle Busch, wrote that he didn't have the words. People from the Formula One paddock also expressed their condolences. Nobody quite did. At Charlotte Motor Speedway, where the Coca-Cola 600 weekend was already underway, the response was immediate and personal. Charlotte was Kyle Busch's track. In a way, it belonged to almost no one else. He was the winningest driver in the Speedway's history across all 3 NASCAR National Series. A record that speaks not just to talent, but to a particular and sustained dominance over a place where dominance is never guaranteed. On Friday evening, before the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series race, the Speedway held a moment of silence. The engines were quiet. The crowd stood. It was the kind of silence that fills a space completely. At Indianapolis, the tributes carried their own particular shape. On Friday, a moment of silence before Carb Day, the final practice session before the race, a day that is usually pure anticipation. And on Sunday, during the race itself, something that only numbers can say the way words sometimes cannot. On lap 18, the pylon at Indianapolis Motor Speedway lit up in honor of the number 8 car. Kyle Busch's number, a circle of light for 1 lap, in the middle of the greatest race in the world. The Coca-Cola 600. It is worth pausing here because the connection between Kyle Busch and this race between Kyle Busch and Charlotte Motor Speedway is not incidental. In May of 2018, he arrived at Charlotte needing one thing: not a championship, not a points lead, not a statistical milestone in the conventional sense. He needed Charlotte itself. Because Charlotte was the last track on the entire NASCAR Cup Series schedule where he had never won a points-paying race. Every other track, every oval, every road course, every superspeedway on the calendar he had already conquered. Charlotte alone had kept him waiting. He started from the pole that night. He led 377 of 400 laps. He swept every stage of the longest race of the season. And when the checkered flag fell, he became something no driver in NASCAR history had ever been before. The only man to win a points-paying race at every track on the Cup Series schedule. On his radio, in the moment after crossing the finish line, His voice broke slightly, with something that sounded less like a champion and more like a child from Las Vegas who had once watched this sport from a distance and decided, quietly and completely, that he was going to master it. "Ever since I was a kid," he said, "I dreamed of this. That was Charlotte. That was the Coca-Cola 600. And that is the race that will run this Sunday." With his number absent from the field, his car silent in a garage that Childress Racing has announced will not carry the number 8 again this weekend. Some numbers, in some moments, are not replaced. They are simply left. The weekend that was supposed to belong to speed now belongs to something else, to the particular heaviness of a sport that has lost one of its own without warning, without preparation, without the chance to say what should have been said while there was still time to say it. And so we begin here not at the beginning of his story, but at the end of it, and at the question the end always asks about everything that came before. Who was Kyle Busch? Not the number, not the record, not the reputation that preceded him into every garage and every press conference for 20 years. The man, the driver, the husband who stood in victory lane crying, "On 8." The father who brought his son to the track and watched him fall in love with the same thing that had consumed his own life since before he could fully understand it. The answer takes a while to tell properly. We have the whole night. Stay with me. We're going back to the beginning, to Las Vegas, to a family, to 2 brothers and 1 road. Las Vegas is a city built on reinvention. People arrive there from somewhere else, start over, become something different than they were. The neon and the desert and the particular flatness of the Nevada landscape create a place that feels, somehow, outside of normal time, a city where the past is easy to leave behind and the future is always being negotiated. Tom and Gay Busch arrived from Schaumburg, Illinois, with 2 things they carried everywhere: a love of cars and the kind of restless energy that finds its outlet on a racetrack rather than a casino floor. Tom was a mechanic at a Ford dealership. He raced locally at the small bullring oval that sat north of the Strip, far from the tourists and the lights, in the part of Las Vegas where people actually lived. It was not a glamorous operation. It was a family hobby, Tom building and maintaining his own cars, Gay bundling up the kids and bringing them to the grandstands, Grandma alongside, everyone watching Dad race on weekend nights. Their son, Kurt, was born in 1978. Kyle came 7 years later, on May 2nd, 1985. And from the very beginning, it was clear that the younger one was different. Tom Busch once described the challenge of raising Kyle not as getting him interested in cars, but as getting him away from them. He was always busy, Tom told NBC Sports, and you didn't have to get him out to the garage, you had to get him into the house. This is the detail that tells you everything. While other children needed encouragement, needed direction, needed someone to show them the path, Kyle Busch had already found the path and was running down it before anyone thought to point. He worked on Kurt's car as a boy, his father said, probably more than Kurt did. He absorbed the mechanics of racing not as a lesson but as an instinct, the way some children absorb language or music or mathematics, not because they are trying to learn it, but because it is simply the shape their mind takes naturally. His mother, Gay, had her own view of the matter. Education came first in the Busch household. Both Kurt and Kyle were in honors classes, and Gay made it clear that poor grades would end the racing, full stop. She had not expected racing to become what it became. It was our hobby, she said, and we didn't know it would grow to this level. It grew to this level because the boys were thoroughbreds. Kurt went first. He was 7 years older, which, in the world of young racing, means he cleared the path ahead. Legends cars at the Vegas Bull Ring, late model competition, the long ladder of regional racing that eventually leads, for the very few who are good enough, to NASCAR's national stage. Kurt reached NASCAR first, and he was exceptional. He won the Cup Series championship in 2004, a fact that would have been the defining achievement of any other family's racing story. In the Busch family, it was the opening act. Kyle followed the same route, but faster. Go-karts, on makeshift tracks, in cul-de-sacs, and parking lots. Legends cars at the same bullring where his father had raced, where his brother had raced, where the Busch family name had been accumulating weight for years before anyone outside Nevada knew it. By 13, he was competing in Legends Car Series. By 16, he had made his NASCAR debut in the Truck Series, driving for Roush Racing. 16 years old. He was old enough to drive to the track, but not old enough, in most states, to drive home from it alone after dark. And yet, even then, even at that age, in that first exposure to the professional level of a sport that eats young drivers alive, people who watched him noticed something. Not just speed, though there was speed. Not just aggression, though that was there too, already visible. Already the thing that would define his reputation for the next 20 years. What they noticed was the way he understood the car. The feel he had for what it was doing beneath him, for where the limit was, and how close he could get to it without crossing it, for the 1,000 small adjustments that happen in racing below the level of conscious thought. It was the thing his father had tried to give him, the thing that cannot entirely be taught. Kurt, watching his younger brother come up through the ranks, said something that he would repeat in various forms throughout their careers. He said it without envy, without the complicated feelings that brothers in competition might be expected to have. He said it plainly, as a statement of fact. "You think I'm a pretty good race car driver?" Kurt told anyone who would listen. "Wait until you see my brother. He's the best driver in the family." From a NASCAR Cup Series champion, that is not a small thing to say. They graduated from the same high school, Durango High School, Las Vegas. Two brothers, 7 years apart, wearing the same school colors, carrying the same last name into a sport that would eventually make that name mean something specific and permanent. When they came back to Las Vegas for races in later years, Kurt would speak about the bull ring and the people who had helped them with a warmth that was uncharacteristic of his usual public manner. "Every time I come out here," Kurt said, "it reminds me of all the people that helped Kyle and I, especially our dad, Tom. Tom Busch, the mechanic from Illinois who moved to Nevada and built cars in his garage on weekends, had not set out to create two NASCAR champions. He had set out to share something he loved with the people he loved most. The fact that it became what it became was not a plan. It was just what happened when you put the right fuel in the right engine and let it run." Kyle once said that his father was the main reason he got into racing, that everything he learned from him. That the weekends traveling together, the hours in the garage, the particular quality of attention his father gave to the work, all of it added up to something he could not have gotten anywhere else. His mother had wanted him to be an orthodontist. He had other ideas. The road from Las Vegas leads north to NASCAR country, to the biggest stages in American motorsport. And on that road, one question was already forming, not whether Kyle Busch would make it, but what kind of driver he would become when he did. He was booed before he did anything wrong. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal description of what happened when Kyle Busch was introduced to the crowd at his first Xfinity Series race. He walked out for driver introductions young, nervous in the way that 20-year-olds are nervous, even when they are trying not to show it, and the crowd booed. Not a murmur. A genuine, committed, directed boo. He stood there, confused. "What? I didn't even do anything," he thought. "It's Kyle, not Kurt." He would tell that story later with laughter in it, the way you laugh at something that stopped hurting a long time ago. But at the time, standing in front of a crowd that had already decided what it thought of him before he had thrown a single punch or wrecked a single car, it was a strange and clarifying moment. The verdict had been delivered before the evidence was in. He spent the next 20 years proving the crowd right about some of it and wrong about most of it, and never really caring either way. Kyle Busch arrived in the NASCAR Cup Series full-time in 2005 as a 19-year-old driving for Hendrick Motorsports, having already debuted in the Busch Series in 2003 and made his Cup Series debut the following year on his home track in Las Vegas at the age of 18. He won Rookie of the Year. He set records. He became the youngest pole winner in Cup Series history at California Speedway. He led laps at rates that made experienced observers stop and look twice, because what they were watching was not the tentative performance of a young driver finding his footing. It was someone who had arrived already, knowing what he was doing, and impatient to do more of it. And then there was everything else. The outbursts, the radio tirades when the car wasn't right, or the pit stop was slow, or a competitor had done something he felt was wrong. The crash at the 2007 All-Star race, where he forced a move that took both him and his brother Kurt out of the race, his own brother, on the same track, on the same night. The incidents that accumulated into a reputation that was difficult to manage and impossible to ignore. There was a word that NASCAR fans invented for what Kyle Busch did to the lower series, a verb built from his last name, bushwhacking. The definition was simple. A Cup Series superstar shows up in an Xfinity or Truck Series race, takes the win away from younger, less experienced drivers who are fighting for their careers, and leaves. Kyle Busch did this more consistently and more unapologetically than anyone in the modern era of the sport. He would win a Truck Series race on Saturday, a Cup Series race on Sunday, and see nothing whatsoever wrong with either of those things. Fans of the lower series and the drivers competing in them disagreed. The argument against him was not irrational. NASCAR's developmental series exist, in theory, to develop drivers, to give young talent a place to grow, to win, to build confidence and momentum before the step up to the highest level. When a two-time Cup champion climbs into one of those cars and leads wire to wire, the developmental logic collapses. The kid who needed that win to keep his sponsor goes home empty-handed. The superstar goes home with another trophy he didn't particularly need. Busch's response to this argument was consistent and unambiguous. He was there to race. Racing meant winning. If you didn't want him to win, you were welcome to go faster. "They're just jealous," he said, in various forms, many times. This was not a sentiment designed to win friends. Add to that the radio. NASCAR broadcasts the team communications during races. The conversations between driver and crew chief and Kyle Busch's radio was, for years, some of the most reliably combustible content on the airwaves. When the car wasn't handling correctly, he said so, at length, with specific and colorful language directed at whoever he felt was responsible. When a pit stop cost him track position, the crew heard about it immediately. When a competitor made a move he considered dirty, he announced his intention to return the favor, and then, more often than not, followed through. He rarely apologized for any of it. After bad races, he sometimes declined press availability entirely, simply walked past the media area without stopping, which in NASCAR's tightly controlled PR environment reads as something close to open rebellion. After incidents on track, he would occasionally confront other drivers directly in the pit lane or the garage, with the cameras rolling and the outcome uncertain. The crowd booed. He absorbed it. Some days he seemed to find it energizing, the particular focus of thousands of people directing their displeasure at one specific target can, for certain personalities, function less like pressure and more like fuel. By the time he left Hendrick, the reputation was fully formed. Brilliant, yes. Worth watching, absolutely. But loud and sharp and allergic to the kind of manufactured humility that makes athletes easier to root for. The sport had a villain. The villain had a nickname. Rowdy didn't mind at all. Rick Hendrick, who had signed him at 18 with the belief that talent eventually finds its discipline, ran out of patience. In 2007, he let Kyle Busch go officially to make room for Dale Earnhardt Jr., the most popular driver in NASCAR, whose arrival made business sense that was hard to argue with. But the subtext was clear enough. The talent was real. The rest of it was more than the team wanted to manage. Kyle Busch, 22 years old, sat with the knowledge that the best team in the sport had decided he wasn't worth the trouble. "I thought my career was over," he said years later. Who the hell is going to want to take a chance on a firestorm of emotions of Kyle Busch? The answer was Joe Gibbs. Gibbs, a Super Bowl-winning NFL coach turned NASCAR team owner, a man of deep faith and extraordinary patience, called Busch every day during the period between his release from Hendrick and his eventual signing with JGR. Not a representative, not an assistant. Joe Gibbs himself, calling a 22-year-old kid who had just been fired just to talk. Busch had visited 8 different teams on what he would later describe as the shop tour, the uncomfortable process of going from organization to organization, hat in hand, making the case for why a driver with his record of incidents was worth the investment. At the end of that tour, it was Gibbs who made the offer. But before he did, he asked a question that cut through the pleasantries. "You're kinda this fireball of emotions type kid, and you're kinda in trouble a lot," Gibbs said. "Why should we hire you?" It was exactly the right question, and something in the asking of it, the directness of it, the absence of corporate softening, told Busch something about the man asking it. He signed with Joe Gibbs Racing in 2008. He would stay for 15 years. What made Kyle Busch exceptional as a driver is difficult to reduce to a single quality, because the truth is that several things were happening at once, a combination so specific to him that no one else in the modern era has quite replicated it. There was the aggression first. Not recklessness, though his critics would sometimes conflate the two, but a calculated willingness to take the line that other drivers left available because they judged it too tight, too late, too risky. Busch judged it differently. He had a feel for the edges of what a car could do that his contemporaries described with a kind of reluctant admiration. Reluctant because many of them had been on the receiving end of it, and admiring because they understood, watching it from the inside, what it actually took. There was the versatility. This is the statistic that, more than any other, defines what he was. He is the only driver in NASCAR history to win races in all 3 National Series Cup, Xfinity, and Truck in a single weekend. Not once, twice. End quote. Both times at Bristol Motor Speedway in 2010 and again in 2017. The same track, the same feet, 7 years apart, as if once wasn't enough to make the point. He is the all-time wins leader in both the Xfinity Series and the Truck Series by a margin that is not close. He won 234 races across the 3 series combined, a number so far beyond anyone else that it occupies its own category. Most elite drivers in NASCAR specialize. They find their level, focus their energy, protect their equipment for the races that matter most to their championship campaign. Busch raced everything. He showed up in the Truck Series on Saturday and the Cup Series on Sunday, and treated both with the same hunger, the same preparation, the same refusal to leave anything on the table. His peers found this, depending on their mood, either inspiring or deeply irritating. And then there was the feedback. The ability to get into a car, run a handful of laps, and come back to the team with a precise description of what the car was doing and what it needed. A description so specific and so accurate that engineers learned, over time, to trust it completely. This is the thing that separated him from drivers who were merely fast. Fast drivers are common enough at the elite level that speed alone doesn't win championships. What wins championships is the ability to communicate, to translate sensation into information, to tell the people around you what you feel in a language they can act on. Busch was exceptionally good at this. It was, in the end, what made him worth the firestorm. The nickname stuck because it fit. Rowdy borrowed from the character in Days of Thunder, Tom Cruise's racing film, a nod to the aggression and the noise and the refusal to be managed. He wore it without apology. He never pretended to be something calmer or more convenient. He was what he was, on the track and off it. And the people who loved him for exactly that reason. The people who booed him, and there were always people who booed him, were, in a way, also responding to the same thing. Not to a villain, to someone who was completely, unambiguously, uncomplicatedly himself. In a sport full of people managing their image, that was its own kind of rare. If this story is keeping you company tonight, if you want to hear more like it, about the athletes who defined their sports and complicated them and left marks that didn't wash off, consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscriber tells us there's someone out there who wants these stories told, and we have many more to tell. Next, we go to Joe Gibbs Racing, where Rowdy finally found a home and where the greatest chapter of his career was about to begin. Joe Gibbs did not hire a driver in 2008. He made a bet on a person. The distinction matters. Drivers are evaluated on lap times and statistics and the cold arithmetic of what they can produce in a race car. People are evaluated on something harder to measure, on what they might become, on whether the fire inside them is the kind that destroys or the kind that eventually, with the right conditions, produces heat that can be pointed at something useful. Gibbs had asked Kyle Busch directly, "You're kinda this fireball of emotions type kid, and you're kinda in trouble a lot. Why should we hire you?" It was not a rhetorical question. It was a genuine one, from a man who had spent decades in professional sports watching talented people fail, not because they lacked ability, but because nobody around them ever asked them the hard questions out loud. Busch answered it. Gibbs believed him. And in January of 2008, at 22 years old, Kyle Busch climbed into the number 18 Toyota Camry for Joe Gibbs Racing, a car that would become, over the next 15 years, as associated with his name as any car in the modern history of the sport. 4 races into the 2008 season, he won. Not scraped through. Won, leading 173 of 325 laps at Atlanta Motor Speedway, 2 seconds clear of the field, dominant in the way that serves notice rather than simply records a result. Toyota had been trying to break through in NASCAR for years. Kyle Busch, in his 4th race for a new team, did it for them. He won 8 races that year. 8 in a single season, at 22 years old. The fireball, it turned out, was useful after all. What followed over the next 15 years was one of the most sustained periods of individual excellence in the history of American motorsport. The numbers, listed plainly, do not fully convey what they represent, but they are worth stating plainly before anything else. In 15 seasons with Joe Gibbs Racing, Kyle Busch won 56 Cup Series races. He won the Xfinity Series Championship in 2009 and set the all-time wins record in that series with 102 victories. He accumulated 69 wins in the Truck Series. He made the championship 4 NASCAR's Final 4 title contenders in 5 consecutive seasons from 2015 to 2019. He won the Brickyard 400, one of the most prestigious races on the calendar, twice. He won the Southern 500 at Darlington. He won the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte. He won at super speedways and road courses and short tracks, and on dirt. He won everywhere, constantly, for 15 years. And he did it in a way that consistently reminded people watching that what they were seeing was not simply the product of good equipment and good fortune. It was a specific intelligence applied to a specific problem, week after week, with a consistency that very few athletes in any sport have ever managed to sustain. The 2010 season brought a moment that defined what Kyle Busch was in a way that statistics alone never could. Bristol Motor Speedway, August. One of NASCAR's most iconic tracks, a concrete half-mile bowl where the banking is steep and the racing is brutal and the crashes are loud enough to feel in your chest from the grandstands. On Saturday, Busch won the Xfinity Series race. On Sunday, he won the Cup Series race. In between, he won the Truck Series race. 3 races, 3 different cars, 3 different levels of competition, 1 weekend. He walked into victory lane after the Cup race carrying a broom, the universal sporting symbol for a sweep, and the crowd, which had spent years booing him, did not quite know how to respond to something that had never happened before. He would do it again at Bristol in 2017. The same track, the same sweep, 7 years later, as if once was not sufficient proof. The JGR years also carried weight that had nothing to do with racing. In January of 2019, before the season began, J.D. Gibbs died. He was 49 years old, Joe Gibbs's son, the co-owner of the team, a man who had been part of the organization since its earliest days, who had been fighting a neurological disease for years with the same quiet determination that characterized everything the Gibbs family did. His death hit the team deeply. It hit Kyle Busch deeply. That year, Joe Gibbs Racing won the championship. Busch, Denny Hamlin, and Martin Truex Jr. all made the Final Four. At Homestead, on the night that decided everything, it was Busch who crossed the line first, winning his second Cup Series title in a season that had started in grief for a team that had decided, in the face of loss, to race as hard as it knew how. Busch, after the race, said the season had been for Joe, for the team, for JD. He did not, as he might once have, say it had been for himself. 3 more years followed, good years, mostly competitive, professional, the comfortable rhythm of a man who knows exactly where he belongs and what he is capable of. And then, at the end of 2022, the rhythm stopped. The M&M's sponsorship, the candy brand that had decorated the number 18 car for years, that had become inseparable from the image of Kyle Busch at Joe Gibbs Racing, departed. Without it, the financial equation changed. And Joe Gibbs Racing, looking at the numbers and at the future, made a decision. The team would make room for Ty Gibbs, Joe's grandson, the next generation of the family, arriving to claim its place. Busch was not offered a contract that worked. The door that had been open for 15 years closed quietly, and without the ceremony the relationship deserved. He did not take it well. He was not expected to. "Something that is so disappointing to me and so hurtful," he said, his voice carrying more rawness than he usually allowed in public, "is they were like family. For 15 years, Joe had my back in the stupidest of moments that Kyle Busch was, and it's gone. Just flipped and gone, like nothing I've ever been a part of." He stood in front of the number 18 car after his final race at Phoenix, the car painted in a colorful mosaic tribute, and could not look at it directly. "I couldn't even look at my car," he said. "That is not what a man says about a job. That is what a man says about a home." The next chapter begins with 2 broken legs, a championship that should have been impossible, and the moment that tells you everything you need to know about who Kyle Busch was when it mattered most. The crash happened on a Saturday of February 21st, 2015. Not a Sunday, not the race that mattered for the championship, not the Daytona 500 that the whole sport had been building toward for months. A Saturday. The Xfinity Series race, the support event, the race Kyle Busch entered, because he always entered every race available to him, because that was simply who he was and how he operated. 9 laps from the end, a multi-car incident unfolded just past the start-finish line. In the chaos, Busch's number 54 Toyota lost its steering. With no way to direct the car, it veered toward the inside of the track at full speed toward the concrete wall that bordered the grass field at the entrance to Turn 1. Not the soft, safer barrier that lines most of a modern NASCAR circuit, concrete. The unforgiving kind. He hit at 90 miles per hour. The impact registered 90 gravities of force. "A whale of a hit," he would say later. "The hardest I've ever had in NASCAR." He knew immediately. Before the car stopped moving, before the dust settled, before the medical crew had even reached the wreck, he knew. The throttle pedal had crunched back into his right leg. Something had happened to his left foot. He sat in the car and ran a quick, terrible inventory of his own body. When the first responder reached him, Busch said it plainly, "My legs are broke." The man looked at him. "What?" "My legs are broke." They lowered him onto a stretcher and took him to Halifax Medical Center. The diagnosis confirmed what he already knew: a compound fracture of the right lower leg, a midfoot fracture of the left foot. 2 surgeries. The first, that night in Daytona. The second, 4 days later, at a hospital in Charlotte. He would miss the Daytona 500 the next morning. He would miss the first 11 races of the Cup Series season. In the hospital, in the hours after the crash, he had a thought that he would later describe with a quietness that made it more devastating than any outburst would have been. "Man, I'm going to have to go back to laying decals," he thought. "I don't know if I'm ever going to get back in a car again." Laying decals, the entry-level work of a racing shop, the thing a young kid does before he has proven himself, before anyone knows his name. The thought, arriving in that hospital bed, was Kyle Busch measuring the distance between where he was and where he might be headed if the worst proved true. It did not prove true. What followed is the part of the story that people who know NASCAR tend to reach for first when they explain who Kyle Busch was, because it is the part that strips away the reputation and the records and the noise and shows you something fundamental about the person underneath. He could not race for 11 weeks. He spent that time in recovery, painful, methodical, consuming recovery, relearning how to walk before he could think about relearning how to drive. His wife Samantha was pregnant with their first child. The season was unfolding without him, and the rules of the 2015 NASCAR Championship system required him to qualify for the playoffs on points, which meant he needed to race and win enough races in the second half of the season to earn a position that other drivers had been building toward since February. He returned at Charlotte in late May for the Coca-Cola 600, still recovering, still adapting to the hardware the surgeons had placed in his leg and foot. He finished 11th. He was not yet himself, but he was there. Then he began to win. The wins came in the second half of the season with a focus and an urgency that his teammates would later describe as something different from his usual intensity, and his usual intensity was already extreme. He needed victories to qualify for the chase. He got them. The wins came in rapid succession, each one more urgent than the last. Sonoma, on June 28th, the road course his team had worried about, given how physically demanding the braking zones are on an injured foot. Daytona, on July 5th. Kentucky, on July 11th. Indianapolis, on July 26th. 4 wins in less than a month. 4 times climbing out of the car on legs that still carried the hardware of 2 surgeries. 4 times standing in victory lane, knowing that each one was buying him back something the crash had nearly taken for good. He qualified for the playoffs on the last possible opportunity, but he qualified. And then, in the playoffs, something shifted. The driver who had spent years being the most talented and the most frustrating, the one who could win any race but sometimes seemed to find ways to lose the ones that mattered most, became something else entirely. Calm, where he had been reactive. Patient, where he had been impulsive. It was as if the crash, and the months of recovery, and the forced stillness of sitting out 11 races while the season went on without him, had recalibrated something. He won the 2015 NASCAR Cup Series championship at Homestead in November. Not a full season, 11 races missed, a season begun in a hospital bed. 25 races to do what others had done in 36. In the middle of all of it, on May 18th, while he was still working his way back toward full fitness, still calculating what he needed to do to make the playoffs, his son Brexton was born. He stood in the hospital room, holding his newborn son, and whatever the year had already demanded of him was briefly beside the point. Racing seasons end. Records get broken. The things you win and the things you lose eventually blur together in the long view of a career. This did not blur. Later, when asked about the 2015 season, about the crash and the surgery and the comeback and the championship, Busch would occasionally say something that surprised people who expected him to frame it as a story of triumph over adversity. He said the crash changed him. Not just physically, though, the injuries left marks that never entirely disappeared. A foot that occasionally flared up years later on road courses. A body that carried the memory of 90 gravities in ways that showed up at unexpected moments. But something else, something in how he understood what the racing was for, and what it cost, and what it was worth. The man who returned to the car in May of 2015 was not identical to the man who had left it in February. He was not softer. His competitors would have laughed at the suggestion. But he was different. More deliberate. More aware, perhaps, that the thing he had built his life around could be taken from him in a fraction of a second by a car with broken steering and a concrete wall. He never forgot that. Some lessons are delivered at 90 miles per hour and 90 gravities, and they do not require repetition. Tonight we followed him from a crash that could have ended everything to the championship that proved it hadn't. Next, the woman who stood beside him through all of it, and the years of quiet struggle that would test them both in ways no racetrack ever could. There is a version of Kyle Busch's story that lives entirely on the racetrack. That version is extraordinary. The records, the championships, the sweep at Bristol, the comeback from Daytona. It is the version that sports pages tell, the version that will appear in whatever official history NASCAR eventually writes of his career. But there is another version, quieter, and in many ways more honest. The version that happened in waiting rooms and hospitals and conversations that never made the broadcast. The version that his wife Samantha carried with her through 15 years of marriage while the world watched only the car. That version begins in 2007 at a promotional event, where Kyle Busch met a young woman from Charlotte who was working in marketing and had no particular interest in NASCAR beyond the professional requirements of the day. Her name was Samantha Sarkinella. He asked for her number. She gave it to him, with the measured caution of someone who had heard enough about racing drivers to be appropriately skeptical. He called. She answered. And whatever skepticism she had arrived with did not survive the early months of getting to know the person on the other side of the phone, not the driver, not the public figure, but the man who called every day and meant it when he asked how she was doing. They married on New Year's Eve, 2010, at the Intercontinental Hotel in Chicago, a celebration that felt, by all accounts, like exactly the right note on which to begin a decade that would ask more of both of them than either had anticipated. In the first years of their marriage, they tried to start a family. It did not happen naturally. They turned to IVF, a process that, as Samantha would later describe publicly, costs upward of $20,000 per round and is covered by insurance rarely, if ever. After their first round of IVF, it worked. On May 18, 2015, in the middle of the championship season, between the Daytona crash and the Homestead title, Brexton Locke Busch was born. Samantha called him a miracle, not as a figure of speech, as a precise description of what he was to them after everything it had taken to get there. Kyle, standing in the hospital room with his newborn son in his arms, was a man who had broken both legs 3 months earlier and was in the middle of clawing his way back to a championship. None of that was in the room with him in that moment, just the boy. They wanted to give Brexton a sibling, and that is where the harder story begins. In 2018, Samantha miscarried. In 2019, another round of IVF failed. In 2020, they tried with a surrogate, a woman who had come forward through Samantha's social media, a stranger who had read their story and offered to carry their child. That did not work out either. They tried IVF again. Samantha became pregnant with twin girls. 2 weeks later, both were gone. Her body did not register the loss immediately, continued acting as though the pregnancy was ongoing, growing 2 empty sacs. She waited. Eventually, 2 days before Mother's Day, she had to undergo a procedure to end it. She spoke about this publicly, with a directness that left no room for comfortable distance. She described the marital strain, how she and Kyle had never dealt with something so heavy before, how grief had no language between them at first, how they did not know what the other needed in those moments and had to learn it the hard way. Through counseling and time and the particular stubbornness of two people who had decided not to let the weight break what they had built. "We had a lot of marital struggles," she said in one interview. "We worked on it. We worked really hard." They went back to their surrogate. One more attempt. On May 10th, 2022, Lennox Key Busch was born. When they announced the pregnancy the previous year, the caption on their social media post was simple and said everything. "You can't have a rainbow without a storm." In 2015, the same year Brexton was born, Kyle and Samantha founded the Bundle of Joy Fund. The idea had come to them in a waiting room sitting at their fertility clinic. They overheard another couple say quietly that money was the only thing standing between them and a chance at having a child. Kyle and Samantha looked at each other. The foundation followed. Over the years, it became something larger than either had imagined. More than 150 grants awarded, more than $2 million distributed, more than 100 babies born to parents who might otherwise have had to stop. Samantha wrote a book about their journey, appeared at the White House to speak about IVF access, built a public platform around the specific and unglamorous truth of infertility. Kyle stood beside her at every turn, not always the most comfortable place for a man who had spent his career being loudest on the racetrack, but there nonetheless. The man who had spent years being called rowdy learned it, in those waiting rooms and hospital visits, a different kind of patience than any racetrack had required of him. Brexton grew up in the paddock. By 10 years old, he had 45 wins in a single karting season, a number that made people who knew what they were looking at stop and look twice. He had his father's instincts and something of his father's fire, and Kyle watched from the pit wall with an expression that people who had known him for years said they had not seen on him before. Not the champion, not the competitor, just a father watching his son go fast. In March of 2026, less than 3 months before he died, Kyle appeared on Samantha's podcast. They talked about their children, about their faith, about what the years had built between them. He was 41 years old. He had won a truck series race the previous month, standing in victory lane with Lennox in his arms and Brexton at his side and Samantha beside him, all of them together in the place where his life had always made most sense. It was, without anyone knowing it, close to the last time the world would see them all like that. We're nearly at the end now. Next, Richard Childress Racing, the final chapter of his career and the last win. When Kyle Busch walked out of Joe Gibbs Racing at the end of 2022, he did not walk quietly. He had said what needed to be said about the hurt of it, about the 15 years that had become a home and then suddenly weren't, about the feeling of something being flipped off like a switch. And then, because he was who he was, he went to work. The team he was joining was not Joe Gibbs Racing. It was Richard Childress Racing, a storied organization, one of the oldest in NASCAR, built around the memory of Dale Earnhardt and the particular grit of a man who had raced his own cars before he owned anyone else's. Richard Childress was not Joe Gibbs. The number 8 Chevrolet was not the number 18 Toyota. The manufacturer was different. The engines were different. The culture was different. Kyle Busch was 47 races into the longest winless streak of his career. He had not won a Cup Series race since Bristol, 2022. For most drivers, a stretch like that is unremarkable. For Kyle Busch, it was the longest drought of his professional life. He won in his second race with RCR. Fontana, California, the Auto Club Speedway. He led the field and crossed the line with the ease of someone who had simply been waiting for the right car to be pointed in the right direction. His radio crackled with the particular joy that only victory lanes produce. The streak was over. The doubters, and there had been doubters, people who suggested that the best years were behind him, that the move to RCR was the beginning of a quiet decline, had their answer. "Fast cars cure all," he said afterward. 2023 brought 3 wins in total: Fontana, Talladega, and Gateway. He made the playoffs. He finished 14th in points. It was not the championship form of 2015 or 2019, but it was proof that the engine was still running. 2024 was harder. The next-gen car, NASCAR's new standardized chassis, introduced in 2022, had initially suited RCR's technical understanding better than most teams. By 2024, the rest of the field had caught up, and RCR had not kept pace. Busch went winless in Cup. So did 2025. He understood the situation with the clarity of someone who had been in this sport long enough to know when a team was struggling and when it was simply in a rough patch. He said publicly that the team needed to be better. He said it without blaming anyone in particular and without softening it beyond recognition. He said it the way he had always said things, directly and without particular concern for how it landed. But he was not done. He made that clear, too. In an interview in early 2026, he was asked about retirement, about when he saw himself walking away from the sport that had consumed his life since he was a teenager in a Las Vegas bullring. His answer was specific. He wanted to race until Brexton turned 15. He wanted to still be out there, on the same circuit his son would one day join, competing at the level his son would need to aspire to. He wanted Brexton to grow up watching his father race, not watch his father retire. "I'm not done yet," he said. "There's plenty more to do." On the 21st of February 2026, Kyle Busch won the Truck Series race at Echo Park Speedway in Hampton, Georgia. And then his family came to him. Samantha was there. Brexton was there, at 10 years old, running to his father in victory lane with the particular urgency of a child who has grown up around racing but has not yet learned to be casual about his father winning. Lennox was there, 4 years old, held in Kyle's arms in the photographs that would circulate throughout the NASCAR world in the days following his death. A little girl in victory lane, her father's helmet still on the car, the confetti still in the air. The image of that moment, all 4 of them, together, in the place where Kyle Busch had spent the happiest hours of his professional life, was the last victory lane photograph the sport would ever have of him. On the 15th of May, 6 days before he died, he won again. Dover Motor Speedway, the Monster Mile, his record 5th Truck Series win at that track. After the race, a Fox Sports reporter asked him why these moments never got old, why a man with 234 career wins across 3 series still reacted to winning the way he did. His answer, in retrospect, carries the particular weight of things said without knowing they are the last things. "Because you never know when the last one is," he said. "I know all too well, unfortunately." He paused after saying it, as if the sentence had surprised him slightly coming out. Then he smiled, the way Rowdy smiled, not softly, but with the full confidence of someone who had been in victory lane more times than almost anyone alive, and intended to be there many more times still. 6 days later, he was gone. Richard Childress Racing announced that the number 8 would be temporarily retired, not replaced, not reassigned to another driver. In their official statement, the team was specific about why. Kyle Busch had been instrumental in designing RCR's stylized number 8, they said. It had become synonymous with him. And then they said the thing that, in the context of everything else, landed with more weight than any statistic could. No one can carry it forward to the level that he did. The number 8, they said, is reserved and ready for Brexton Busch when he is ready to go NASCAR racing. The son who grew up in victory lane. The boy who ran to his father after Hampton. The 11-year-old who, the day after his father died, changed his social media profile photo to a picture of the 2 of them embracing in that same victory lane, arms around each other, helmets off, the confetti still falling. The number will wait for him, however long it takes. The sport that had booed Kyle before he did anything wrong went quiet in the way it rarely does, and in that quiet, something became clear that the noise had sometimes obscured. They had loved him all along, they just hadn't always known how to say it. One chapter left. The legacy, the records, the family he leaves behind, and the question of what it means to live a life as fully as Kyle Busch lived his. There is a number that tells you everything and nothing at the same time. 234. That is how many races Kyle Busch won across the 3 national series of NASCAR over the course of his career. 63 in the Cup Series, 9th on the all-time list, the most among any active driver at the time of his death. 102 in the Xfinity Series, an absolute record, one that stands so far beyond the next name on the list that it occupies its own category. 69 in the Truck Series, another absolute record, built across 21 consecutive seasons in which he won at least one race every single year without interruption. 234 victories in 3 series on 25 different tracks over 2 decades. The number is staggering, and yet the number by itself does not tell you what it felt like to watch him race. Does not tell you about the last 7 laps at Hampton in February, with his family waiting in victory lane. Does not tell you about Bristol, where he won 22 times across 3 series, 8 in Cup, 9 in Xfinity, 5 in trucks, a record of dominance over a single track that no driver in the history of the sport has ever matched. Does not tell you about the team he built himself. Kyle Busch Motorsports. Founded in 2010, which he ran for 13 years, won 100 races with, and delivered 2 Truck Series championships through in 2015 and 2017. The number is the skeleton. The races were the life inside it. He was a 2-time Cup Series champion, 2015 and 2019, and the 2 titles could not have arrived more differently. The first came through broken bones and impossible mathematics, through a season that began in a hospital bed and ended in a championship that defied every reasonable projection. The second came through grief, through a team that had lost its co-owner before the season started and decided, in the face of that loss, to race harder than it knew how. He won Rookie of the Year in 2005 at 20 years old. He won the Xfinity Series championship in 2009. He made the championship for NASCAR's final 4 title contenders in 5 consecutive seasons from 2015 through 2019. A streak of sustained excellence that placed him among the most consistent performers the sport had ever seen. He won the Daytona 500 qualifying race and took the pole position for the 2026 Daytona 500, one of the last great moments of a career that was still, even at 41, still reaching for things. The records, laid out plainly, look like this: 2-time NASCAR Cup Series champion, Xfinity Series champion, Cup Series Rookie of the Year, 63 Cup wins, 102 Xfinity wins, 69 Truck Series wins, 234 victories total, the all-time record holder in 2 of the 3 series he competed in, the winningest driver at Bristol Motor Speedway in the history of that track, the only driver to win races in all 3 series in a single weekend twice. These are the facts. They will not change. They are carved now permanently into whatever accounting the sport keeps of itself. But here is what the facts do not capture. They do not capture Samantha standing in a waiting room in Charlotte, deciding that the financial burden of IVF should not determine who gets to become a parent. They do not capture $2 million in grants and more than 100 babies born to families who needed someone to believe that their dream was worth funding. They do not capture Kyle Busch on the phone with Joe Gibbs every day during the weeks when no one else was calling. They do not capture the man who booed before he did anything wrong and who spent 20 years being exactly himself in response. Not apologizing, not softening, not becoming whatever the crowd wanted him to be. They do not capture Brexton, 10 years old, running across the infield at Hampton, Georgia, in February of 2026, arms out, heading toward his father in victory lane. They do not capture Kyle catching him the helmet already off, the confetti already falling, the race already won and holding on. They do not capture what he said at Dover 6 days before he died when someone asked him why winning never got old. Because you never know when the last one is. The number 8 sits in a garage at Childress Racing, temporarily retired, reserved for a boy who is 11 years old and already accumulating wins at a rate that makes people who know what they are looking at stop and look twice. The number will wait. Kyle Busch had said he wanted to race until Brexton turned 15, wanted to still be out there on the same tracks his son would one day join, wanted the boy to grow up watching his father compete, not retire. He did not get those years. But Brexton grew up watching something. He grew up watching a man who showed up to every race, every series, every track on the calendar, and competed as if the outcome mattered completely, who built a family out of 10 years of trying and never stopping, who stood in victory lanes from Las Vegas to Daytona to Bristol to Hampton and felt something real each time because he understood, better than most, that you never know when the last one is. The last one was Dover, May 15th, 2026, 6 days before the world lost Rowdy. If this story found you tonight, if the life of Kyle Busch kept you company through the quiet hours, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Every like tells us these stories are worth telling. Every subscriber brings another athlete's life into these late hours, the victories, the losses, the human beings behind the numbers. We will keep telling them as long as you keep listening. Sleep well. Good night.